Hey everybody. So we know what genes are from our last topic. Remember, we've got our DNA molecule and it wraps up with the histone proteins to become a chromosome. And we learnt before that a gene is a specific segment of DNA found in the chromosome, and it's got the coded information for making one protein. So, section of DNA contains the code for making a protein. So, the mantra we should be always remembering when we're learning our genetics is that we go from gene to protein. All genes make a protein. Well, they're the instructions. Remember, I love the cookbook analogy. So the gene is like the cookbook. It's got all the instructions, and the proteins are like the cakes. They're the final product once you complete the recipe and cook the cake. Okay, so we're going further than that now. We're starting to look at the fact that there's actually different forms of the same gene. And these are called alleles. So they're different forms of a gene, and the way they're different is that they've got a slightly different code that makes up the gene. So there'll be a couple of letters or bases that are different in the gene. So different forms of a gene, if the pen will actually work, with a slightly different code. So let's look at this gene here. So this is a small segment of the gene. Genes are hundreds and hundreds of bases long, but if you look closely, you can see that this base here, where it's an A or an adenine, and I'm looking closely, and there it is. There's an extra A that's been added in here. So this allele, or this form of the gene, doesn't have that extra A, whereas allele 2, it's got an extra A. And just that one change in letter is enough to change the protein that gets made from the gene. So here's a picture of the two proteins, and you can see in this red area here, there's a slightly different structure that the protein has. Remember, proteins are the large molecules that do all the jobs in cells. And then that change in structure will have a slight effect on the protein's function. So the change in the code leads to a change in the protein structure. Which can often, not always, but it often leads to a change in how that protein actually does its job. And it might even stop it doing its job completely. And that's how we can get an allele that actually causes a disease. So the change in protein structure leads to change in protein function. And if we're continuing with our recipe analogy, so there's a slight change in the wording of the recipe, and that means that the cake you'll make at the end, it's still the same type of cake, so it's still a chocolate cake, but that slight change in wording means you've got a different looking chocolate cake. So the protein's slightly different. Still the same protein, but there's a few changes. So then the next question is, how are there actually different alleles? Wouldn't every gene just have the exact same code? Well, the reason they don't is because of mutations. And mutations are basically the event that causes a change in the DNA sequence. So a change in the DNA sequence, or in other words, the code of a gene. So here's an example. We've got our DNA at the start, and then we've got some incoming UV light, and the UV light causes the DNA molecule to actually break, and a couple of the bases join together here, and that will actually change the sequence of the genetic code. So UV light is a really common way of causing mutations, and that's why staying out in the sun in Australia is so dangerous, because UV light it gets into your skin and it causes damage to your DNA, and that's what can cause skin cancers and just general damage to your skin. So UV light and lots of other chemicals that cause cancer and that cause mutations, they're called mutagens. So there's lots of chemicals and other events. So chemicals and events that cause mutation. And often these mutagens also cause cancer, and so we call them carcinogenic. Okay, so that's the important concepts of genes, alleles, and mutations.